What is up, everybody? Welcome into another edition of the 5280 podcast. It is going to be a two-man show here tonight. Mike is actually going to be going to one of his kids' basketball games, and Glenn is all prepped and ready for an early trip down to Arizona. He said it's basically an in-and-out trip, so I'm assuming that because there's an In-N-Out in Arizona, I'm assuming that's the whole reason why he's going to Arizona. So he's going to Arizona to go in and out and then basically just come back. Like that's the only way that I could actually interpret that. But how you doing, Gage? You doing good?
Straight in and out, and then you just get out right after that.
That's right. Want to thank everybody for hopping in the stream. Want to remind everybody to hit that subscribe button over there on the MHRT Network page. I've been mentioning it in every single show. It's a lofty goal, but let's see if we can get MHRT Network to 2,000 subscribers by the end of 2025. The end of 2025. I think we're at about 1.4 or 1,400, I should say. So make sure you hit that subscribe button over on the MHRT Network page. You can also follow both Gage and I over on the socials. You can follow Gage at Gage Madrid NFL, myself at Cameron Parker PO. Our links are obviously in the viewer. You can clearly see on our picture there of our socials. Also, we have super chats now. So if you guys feel compelled to drop a certain amount for a comment or whatever, it's entirely up to you. It's not forced upon. Give to what you feel is your heart content. So, Gage, we have an exciting show. As clearly as the headline is saying, we're going to be talking, of course, about the 2025 offseason. Now, before we talk about that a little bit later in the show, we should probably do a PSA that says there might be some regurgitated takes from this show that gets transferred over into maybe training camp or somewhere into free agency or something like that. So just as a quick little PSA there.
Yep, for sure. This is starting to enter the area where it's going to be a little bit tough for the next couple of weeks to generate news. We do have the Shrine Bowl, which I will be attending in person. The practices of the Shrine Bowl, that's going to be awesome. We also have the Senior Bowl coming up, so we'll have news there. But after that, it's going to be a lot of rumor mill, a lot of speculation as we head into free agency and head into the draft. I love that time of year personally because it's a good time for content over on Broncos Syndicate. But for fans who don't really follow the game as much, I can understand that it can get a little bit frustrating hearing the same crap regurgitated over and over again. But trust me, it is all leading up to the draft, which is going to be obviously the time where we can really add the bolts and nuts to this roster to tie everything together and make it into what we want it to be next year.
Yeah. And like we said, we're going to talk about the 2025 offseason. So, David, we see your comment there. We're going to bring it up in the offseason chatter once we start having that conversation. But nonetheless, Jeff, it's going to be a fun one. It is going to be a fun off season. And yes, Mundungus, Sam Hartman did make it farther than Bo, Caleb, and Drake, and of course, Spencer Rattler. But we should also preface that he's the second best looking rookie in the draft, because we know who's the best looking quarterback, and that would be Bo Nix.
He'll be the second best quarterback in the UFL when he joins next year.
He actually might join the AAF, and the AAF was disbanded. Let's dive first before we preview the championship weekend, Gage. Let's dive first into the weekend that was, and that was the NFL playoffs, where everybody, of course, except for if you're a Chiefs fan, is looking at these games and just how can we actually find a way to see these Chiefs lose. And it's probably worth that we just start there with the Houston Texans and the Kansas City Chiefs. it looked like things were starting to get a little bit better, there for, for the Kansas City, for the Houston Texans, and it does seem like C.J. Stroud was certainly entering, that sophomore slump. But admittedly, I feel like a lot of it, for this Houston Texans was, there were certainly the slump, but the offensive line had a lot of issues this year in Houston. Obviously, it may not have been centered on Laramie Tunsil, but Houston was a problem on that offensive line.
Hell, even Laramie Tunsil was penalized left and right. He was a contributor to those problems on the line. But it was a lot of communication stuff up front, failure to pick up a stunt, failure to know who's coming on a blitz. Some of that is on Stroud for not setting protections up front, but that's just a poor communication up front by the offensive line. And I would not be surprised at all if Houston contemplates firing their offensive line coach, because it was that poor. And we saw those issues pretty much throughout the entire season. As far as this individual game is concerned, I was actually helping my family move. So I was only really being able to keep an eye on it in spurts. So I can't really speak to what happened in this game in particular. Yeah. But throughout the entire season, the offensive line has not gotten enough blame for issues in Houston. We hear about this whole sophomore slump thing with C.J. Stroud. And yes, Stroud's missed a few throws here or there, but the offensive line has regressed around him, and his top three receivers have all been injured at various points in the year. Two of them, in Stephon Diggs and Tank Dell, suffered significant injuries. So I don't think that C.J. Stroud got enough credit for keeping that team afloat and leading them to the playoffs and to the divisional round of the playoffs. But I can't speak for how this particular game really went down, because, again, I was only really able to pay attention to it in spurts.
And we love you, Mike, when we love you. I think one of the things that I think it's also noteworthy is, the Chiefs are the better team, but it's still one of those cases where this was their first game, right? This was their first game since, they had rested all their starters against the Denver Broncos. So how was it all going to unfold, with the Texans? And I mean, give credit where credit is due. The Texans defense is really good, specifically up front. But there is something going on. And obviously there are things that do happen. We don't necessarily need to dive too much into the particulars of the rigness, if you will. That being the Kansas City Chiefs. But there are some execution. There's some execution things, Gage. There's some execution miscues. There's some, they're just overall, when you look at it, it's there's something still off with Mahomes. He's missing a few throws here and there. Really, one of the strongest takeaways, if I was a Chiefs fan, is that it seems like the chemistry is starting to grow a little bit with Xavier Worthy. But I think that, one of the positive feedbacks, over the course is, for some reason, it's not just this year, but all of, Travis Kelce's entire career, he's always open. And whether that's strictly an Andy Reid thing or that is strictly a Travis Kelce thing, but he has always been open. And, kudos to, some people that were on there on Twitter that noticed this, but it's it seems rare to see Kelce get a contested catch every once in a while. Every single time, it seems, when Kelce's getting the football, it's always an open space, and he's able to, move down the field at will.
Yeah, he's so good at finding those voids in the zone coverage, being a former quarterback. So he knows where to sit down, and Mahomes and him have that crazy, uncanny chemistry. But as far as them just still being a little bit off as a team, we think about them making that run to Super Bowl. I can't remember what Super Bowl was. I want to say Super Bowl 54, the one against the Buccaneers, where they had won the previous year against San Francisco. They had some protection issues up front with their offensive line, and they're still trying to figure that out. They've moved Joe Tooney over to left tackle. That's helped a little bit. They had brought in DJ Humphries, but that still could be an issue that rears its ugly head as we get to probably the Philadelphia Eagles, most likely, who are a damn good team in the trenches. And I think that's probably the worst possible matchup moving forward for this Kansas City Chiefs team. And the Buffalo Bills, they're nobody to sneeze at either, man. They can get after you in the trenches. So I actually believe that this will be a problem that will come back to haunt the Kansas City Chiefs sooner rather than later.
Yeah. And, moving forward with the other game that happened on Saturday was the Washington Commanders against the Detroit Lions. Now, we should preface it this way. This game reminded me a little bit, of when the Denver Broncos were going up against the Indianapolis Colts, in the divisional round with John Fox, Jack Del Rio, and everybody that was there on staff, Adam Gase, and everybody the week during interviewed for so many jobs. And you were starting to hear some rumblings right then and there for that game that that John Fox was leaving, some coaches were leaving, and funny enough, they lose to Washington, and the Pistons are firing in the direction of staff movement and everything, and it ended up being a very disappointing loss for the Detroit Lions. It was let me ask it this way, because I do not want to take away from Dan Quinn, because this was a big Dan Quinn win and overall Commanders win, given everything that they had with ownership, bringing in Dan Quinn, bringing in Cliff Kingsbury, obviously having the offensive rookie of the year in Jaden Daniels. But was this more about an impressive win for the Commanders, or was this more about a disappointing loss for the Detroit Lions?
I think it's kind of a mixture of both, because the Commanders came into this game like a team on a mission. They were bringing pressure after Jared Goff, and we all know that Jared Goff is prone to making mistakes when he's got pressure in his face. And we saw him with that high throw for a pick six, that strip sack fumble. There were multiple times where Jared Goff just kind of cocooned under that pressure. And then offensively, Cliff Kingsbury's known for that college air raid and at times no huddle offense. And in fact, I saw a stat in the game where they ran no huddle at 70% of the time this year. So it's really a no huddle dominated offense. The last time we really saw a no huddle offense like that in the NFL was probably Chip Kelly. So that really caused problems for the Detroit Lions on defense. They weren't able to sub out on defense. Guys were getting tired, and we saw multiple third down and long conversions in this game. And they ended up getting up by 10 points, Washington did, and Detroit was just never able to recover. Some of that, I feel like, was Detroit's injuries on defense started to catch up with them. So many guys going down. Aiden Hutchinson, Aleem McNeil, Carlton Davis. It just was one injury after another. Then Amik Robertson goes down in this game, and it felt like Detroit was picking on whatever corner eventually entered the game for Robertson. I don't remember who it was, but that corner did not have a good game in this one. The Commanders just picked him apart. So ultimately, the Lions just got outmatched in this one, and I feel like there was that bad energy and that bad juju, kind of knowing the coordinators were going to leave. But I don't feel like either one of the coordinators had their best day in this game. I thought Aaron Glenn called a poor game on defense, and I thought that Ben Johnson called a poor game on offense. That trick play with Jamison Williams, what are you doing, bro? Jamison Williams is a knucklehead bonehead both on and off the field. You can't trust him in key moments like that. And what does he do? He throws it into a Commanders team meeting for an interception. And that was basically the play that sealed the game. So, yeah, man, I thought it wasn't a great day for either one of these coordinators. And this was beyond a bad loss for the Lions. This was a heartbreaking loss, a demoralizing loss. And Dan Campbell said it when they went to the NFC Championship game last year. it'll be twice as hard to make it back to this spot next year. And sure enough, he was right.
Rich mentions, that the date. This is what I was talking about earlier. That it seemed like the coaches were preparing for their head coaching interviews, or I should say interviews, and not the game. I will say, for all of that, to still put up 31 points, and all of that is still pretty impressive. And again, like it just felt like Ben Johnson was too much in his own head in that game because, the trick plays are one thing. You know what I mean? Like the trick plays are one thing, but when it is a dominated part of your offense, it means you might not actually be as creative of an offensive mind than maybe people initially thought. I'm not saying he's not a creative mind. It feels like, when you rely heavily on that versus some of the other really well schemed plays that you've been operating well within your, the operation of your offense, it just is a bad reflection on what you have there. Now going forward, and just a brief Chicago Bears talk, I do think that with Caleb Williams, that kind of style will fit exceptionally well for a guy like Caleb Williams once they finally mesh and everything. But that's a quick little bunny trail on that. Dan Quinn, you got to call it for what it is, though. You have to call it for what it was. That was a super, super impressive win. That was probably the most impressive win that Dan Quinn has had, and that's either as a head coach or either as a coordinator with Seattle. Like that is as big of a win, in my opinion, since his Seattle days. Just given everything that is, certainly centered around that. And frankly, you look at the Washington Commanders. Do I think that they rival that, in terms of that particular team? No. But I find it very interesting that, rookie quarterbacks don't win very many games, right? They don't win very many games in the playoffs. Well, the one who, ironically or whatever, and Bronco fans and Seahawks fans know this well, who is a really good quarterback and played quite well with the Seahawks as a rookie and did quite well for himself with the Seahawks, was Russell Wilson. I mean, I'm not saying that the career is going to be shaking out just like that for Jaden Daniels, but I mean, Dan Quinn does a really good job of relating to those younger players and relating to the players that are on that team. So he's clearly done a phenomenal job, and he's hired a really good staff. And I thought that you and I mentioned this before the show. That's probably his best trait that maybe not a lot of people talk about, is that his ability to hire a staff is really, really good. Because like and we mentioned it, you talk about dating back to the Falcons. I mean, he had LaFleur, he had Mike McDaniel, he had Kyle Shanahan. I mean, like, he even had, I think, Clint Kubiak on that staff. Like, he had a lot of people, that were a part of that staff that are even in the NFL now, not at the NFL, but in the NFL now in rather prominent roles. So he's just done a really good job. And I mean, so you have to give the right kudos to Dan Quinn for the job he's done with Washington.
Absolutely. The biggest asset for Dan Quinn is that he is an amazing builder of culture, and he's a good evaluator of teachers who can help relay that to their players. And that's something that I think is very valuable and something that I don't think enough teams covet in this league. The fact that the Denver Broncos hired Nathaniel Hackett over Dan Quinn in 2022, I mean, in hindsight, looks like an absolutely foolish decision. So Dan Quinn has definitely proven a lot of people wrong, and he's proven me wrong. I was not a believer of Dan Quinn going into this. Jaden Daniels is a great person to make you look good at your job, but I think Dan Quinn has done an excellent job learning from previous mistakes that he's made in Atlanta. And I really do believe that Dan Quinn has evolved into the right coach for what this team needed at the time. So, yeah, man, kudos to him for sure.
And I think that as things do progress, whether it's this postseason or in his career, you also have to state the obvious, and that he's going to have to get the monkey off of his back. And that is this was a big game. There's no doubt. We mentioned that. But he's going to have to win the big one. It's basically the one that has been avoiding him his entire career, not counting, Super Bowl 48 when he was a coordinator. But like he's going to have to get there as when he's a head coach, cuz like that's going to be lingering with him. The 28-3 and specifically the back-to-back years where he could have taken that job. You referenced Nathaniel Hackett. And then the other job where he did take another interview with the Broncos job, which they ended up hiring Sean Payton instead of Jim Harbaugh and Dan Quinn, right? So like in both of those particular years, he was with Dallas, and in both of those years, they played the 49ers. They lost both of them. And both of those games, frankly, you should argue like they should have won both of those games, and they didn't. And those are just unfortunate situations on his resume that he's going to have to get over the hump. Now, that Commanders game still was a big one in the right direction, and having Jaden Daniels and the right quarterback and the situation, I think, is going to be really, really paramount for this team. And I think a lot of that credit does go to the new ownership, of Washington, which, funny enough, as well, the Josh Harris was second in the running for the Broncos ownership job. So and this is a slight bunch. I do think we see some Washington and Denver comparisons or some storylines here unfold, whether it be in free agency, or in the future with a lot of different things, given every angle that you want to look at. But yeah, just thought that was interesting.
And, it just feels like Washington and Denver have been so similar in trajectory over these past several years that a lot of those comparisons are naturally going to be made. And, it's really, really cool to see just what Denver has been able to do over these last couple of years in comparison to what Washington's been able to do over these last couple of years. And I think that, like you said, both of these teams are going to be kind of tied at the hip. And as we enter free agency, both of these teams are going to have some money to spend. Who's going to be the more attractive team, Sean Payton and Bo Nix, or Dan Quinn and Jaden Daniels? That's going to be really, really fun.
And, and I did tweet it, but I said it's going to be interesting because, like, it was a competition between the Walton Penner group and the Josh Harris group, for the Broncos ownership, right? And the Harris finished second. So there might be some competition even there for the Walton Penner group to be like, hey, you know what? We have some cash to spend, right? We have some cash to spend, so we'll offer you that, and we'll bring in some of the better price for agents so that we can lure those guys in so they aren't going to Washington, or vice versa. So it's going to be a very interesting conversation. Moving forward to the other part, which I think we could all say that the Rams won this Lions trade, I think, even though it seemed like it has worked well for both sides. Nonetheless, a great divisional matchup, between the Eagles and the Rams, and I got to tell you, obviously, the story of the entire season, even beginning, was where are Saquon Barkley and Derrick Henry going to land? Obviously, we'll talk about the Ravens and Bills game, but there is no player or players that have made more impact on their respective teams than Derrick Henry and Saquon Barkley. Saquon Barkley, in my opinion, is the MVP of the National Football League. And that's just my opinion. I mean, I think that it's probably going to go to Josh Allen and some of these other players. But, you just everything that he has meant to that organization and going home, and then you put into what you and I touched on briefly with the offensive line, Gage. If by happenstance the Eagles do have a reunion with the Kansas City Chiefs, the Eagles will be better suited for that opportunity because of the fact they have Saquon Barkley and not a Miles Sanders.
Yep, I could not agree more. This was a true battle in the trenches, and the Eagles are just a better team in the trenches than the Rams are, and they dominated on both sides. Obviously, the offensive line was clearing holes for Saquon all game long. He had that big run at the end of the game to ice it, but you also think about, oh, well, actually, that didn't ice it because then the Rams got the ball back and they had that opportunity. I was also kind of checked in and out of that game a little bit, but I did see that on both sides of the ball, the Eagles were just winning up front. And Matthew Stafford was getting pressured left and right. And the Rams just had no answers for that. And that's how Philadelphia wants to beat you. They want to beat you playing bully ball. And we saw Jalen Hurts get nicked up at the end of that game. It didn't matter because Saquon Barkley can just put the whole team on his back. And that's exactly what they did. The Rams had that opportunity there at the end of the game, but ultimately they just couldn't overcome the Eagles and how dominant they are in the trenches.
And on the Rams side of things, it does show you, I think, still how close the Rams are. And they have some question marks. We'll probably talk about a certain player. And he won't be the only one in terms of these playoffs that we were talking about here. But there's a certain player that, might be end up linked in terms of the Denver Broncos here. But it still seems though, like the Rams are still really close, to still hitting that threshold. And I know that there's been some rumblings about Matthew Stafford, but, obviously it was a snow game, but you gotta still feel really good if you're a Rams fan, knowing everything that the season was and how it ended, and still ending on the note of, where things are still trending for you, because whether or not Cooper Kupp stays, the fact you have a consistent dynamic weapon of Puka Nacua and a reliable tight end of Tyler Higbee and a plethora of backs between, Blake Corum and Kyron Williams, who shut everybody up, even with his pre-draft process and bombing his NFL combine. Like they've clearly proven that, or I should say Sean McVay has proven that he is still one of the most elite offensive minds.
Absolutely. And the fact that anybody doubted Sean McVay is absolutely foolish. And Matthew Stafford, I know that there are some rumblings out there that he's contemplating retirement. I feel like he still has some good football left in him, and he said the same thing himself. So I'm going to err on Matthew Stafford being back because the Rams really do feel like they are right there with that young offensive core that they've built. And the chemistry that Stafford has with Puka Nacua, with Cooper Kupp if he comes back. It's good to see, like you mentioned, Tyler Higbee finally start to get healthy. All of those pieces are in place. And then you look at the defensive side of the ball where they've got some young pieces in place like Jared Verse, Byron Young, a good young emerging player at linebacker, and Omar Spates. They've got pieces there that they can build around long term. And honestly, I feel like the trajectory of the Rams is only heading up moving forward.
Now moving forward to the game everybody was just glued into, and it wasn't the Chiefs game, right? It wasn't the Chiefs game. No, it was the Bills and Ravens. That game, you look at that game, you look at everything and the way that unfolded, it definitely did not disappoint with the hype, the end result, and everything. That said, as much as we talk about, like what this game meant more, in the vein of like Dan Quinn, being a really big win for Dan Quinn. I've got to think if you look at it just in the grand scheme of things as a whole, Gage, there probably may not have been a much larger win of all the coaches in this playoff than that particular game for Sean McDermott. I'm not entirely sure what the future still holds for him in Buffalo, but that game specifically was massive for his overall future with Buffalo, and even Josh Allen. Just for the legacy of getting over there and then getting back into that AFC Championship game, where he can now shut up the narrative of the Kansas City Chiefs.
I mean, the divisional round for the last couple of years has been the bugaboo for the Buffalo Bills. They lost in 2022 to the Cincinnati Bengals, and then they lost last year to the Kansas City Chiefs. They haven't been back. Oh, and then the year before that, it was the Kansas City Chiefs as well. They haven't been back to the divisional round or to the championship game since 2020. So this was just a really good game for Buffalo to get that monkey off their back. This was unfortunately another one that I couldn't really see in its entirety because I was helping my family move, but I did see the two big defining plays in this game, and that was the drop by Mark Andrews that ended up being basically a fumble, and then that was recovered by the Bills, and then obviously the drop that he had on the 2-point conversion as well. Just brutal, brutal plays right there from a normally sure-handed player in Mark Andrews.
Mm-hmm.
The Baltimore Ravens have got a lot of soul-searching to do after this game because they still cannot get over that hump in the playoffs themselves. And it was going to be interesting to see in this game which team was going to be able to get that monkey off their back. And ultimately, it is the Buffalo Bills. And now there are going to be a lot more narratives slapped on the name of the Baltimore Ravens as we move forward, and they're going to have a lot of questions that they're going to have to answer moving forward.
Jeff Bryan, just thank you so much, man. For the $10 donation, $9.99 donation. Thank you so much, man. We certainly appreciate you. It was really nice to see you and your daughter over there. I forget what the game was. It might have been the Colts game, but it was really nice to see you guys. And hopefully we can see you at another game here in 2025 where the Broncos are still, going to the the playoffs. It's just it's hard for me because I think a lot of people want to put the blame on Lamar.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand the statistics that have, backed it up, which has been, all the rushing yards and everything, for Lamar, or even the touchdowns, that Lamar probably could have had versus like a Josh Allen. But by the same token, I'm not saying they're wrong in the sense that they probably want to use his legs a bit more. But I don't know, Gage, you put it in the best possible situation for your players to win and for your players to succeed. They've got to be able to make a play. And, Mark Andrews, unfortunately, in that game, just coughed it up way too many times for their own liking. And it wasn't just him. There were other situations in that game, where they easily could have just gone down and made things a bit more easier for their team. So I just feel Todd Monken, as much as he's getting offensive coordinator interviews and maybe some, head coaching interviews here, they still feel like one of the one of the AFC's best teams, but it does make you wonder, like Buffalo, can they absolutely find a player that is the dominant number one? Zay Flowers is great, but can they please find someone that can just absolutely be a dominant force on the outside of wide receiver?
Yep. And they've tried to kind of have that pseudo number one with Mark Andrews because he had historically been that number one target for him for all of those years. And unfortunately, he couldn't come up in those key moments in that game. And this is also the second time that we've seen Todd Monken choke in the playoffs for the Baltimore Ravens. He didn't call a good game against the Kansas City Chiefs in the AFC Championship game last year. And this year, he has another stinker against Buffalo. What is the future going to hold at offensive coordinator for Baltimore? Because I don't think he's going to get a head coaching job this cycle. He'll most likely return, but if he has another bad day at the office in the playoffs next year, assuming, of course, that they can make it back, that they can stay healthy, all of that stuff, then there are going to be some serious question marks to answer. We talked about how this game was a big game to answer questions in terms of Sean McDermott, but next year, we could see a similar scenario for Todd Monken and, quite frankly, John Harbaugh as well.
Yeah. There's going to be some hard conversations because it feels like and it's funny we're talking about the AFC North here, but there's going to be some hard conversations here in the future about guys like a John Harbaugh and a Mike Tomlin in the future. Like, where do things go? They are phenomenal coaches, right? They're phenomenal coaches, but can they continue to take their team over the hump? And lately, the last 5 years or so, it's not exactly worked out, as of late. So it's
Feels
going to
like
be.
it could be the way that the days of Mike Shanahan ended here in Denver. It
Mhm.
just kind of staled out at the end, and it felt like something different was needed. Obviously, Josh McDaniels was not what was needed. We'll talk about him a little bit later in this show, I would imagine.
Yeah.
But the Broncos just needed a fresh start, and it feels like a couple of those teams like the Baltimore Ravens, like the Pittsburgh Steelers, might need a fresh start in their own right.
Speaking of fresh start, Gage, feels like a really good time to start talking about this 2025 Broncos offseason. Let's start first with David's comment, because he let it off here well before we actually hit record, but he hit the nail on the head. He said this offseason will be a must watch for the Broncos because the fan base wants to know who Peyton will get for Bo Nix. I feel like that's going to end up being like the largest talking point of this entire offseason. So let's get to a few other comments here before we start chiming in here. Looks like Paul chimes in and says, we have holes at inside linebacker, tight end, running back, positions in need of upgrades, safety, nose guard, wide receiver, and center possibly. And Richie mentions, that I think we have more holes to fill than many I'm hearing. And I think that's always kind of be the case. Like, as soon as you kind of diagnose things and look at the roster, you start to kind of like be like, oh, you know what? Maybe this actually might end up being maybe not a huge need, but it's one where they might be able to go into another direction. As we move down here, there was we brought this comment up, but Jeff Bryan mentions, I heard about possibly them moving on from Singleton and maybe even Barton as well. Let's start first, obviously, right? And David mentioned it right on the top, right? Priority number one, get Bo Nix the amount of weapons possible for this team, Gage. How would you preface your priority number one on this? Because I have wavered. You and I talk about this a lot, but like I have wavered so much with this team in terms of what's the number one priority, because it fluctuates between tight end one, running back one, and wide receiver one still at times. So where do you fall in line with this?
I will continue to say the Denver Broncos have the worst tight end room in the NFL, and they have had the worst tight end room in the NFL for the past 2 seasons. So that is priority number one for me on the offensive side of the ball. You have to get a tight end who is a dominant pass catcher and can be an effective run blocker. The Broncos not having a halfway decent run blocking tight end has hurt them so many times. And we hear fans talk about, why doesn't Sean Payton run the ball? Because they can't run block for shit, and they struggle to generate any penetration up front, and your running backs only end up getting 2 yards per carry. And that all starts with the tight end and the wide receiver position. And until you can get guys who can block, you're not going to have an efficient run game. So that, for me, is priority number one. The running back position is a very close priority number two. It was reported today by Chris Thomason of the Denver Gazette, and this is no surprise. Javonte Williams is not going to be re-signed by the Denver Broncos. He's going to be allowed to explore free agency, and he will be getting another opportunity elsewhere. So you're going to be looking for an RB1 this offseason. And last season, they were very much in on the Josh Jacobs sweepstakes. I would not be surprised if they want to make another running back splash move in free agency. I'm thinking about a Najee Harris. That is my number one option. I've heard some fans say Aaron Jones, but he's a little bit older for my liking. Najee's just going to be turning 28 this coming season. Aaron Jones will be on the wrong side of 30. So that's the direction I think I would go. And just because they signed Najee Harris in free agency doesn't mean that they wouldn't draft an Ashton Genty at number 20 if he fell to them. That would not prevent them from drafting a running back in the second or third round. I think that they're very much going to make multiple additions at the running back position. So on the offensive side of the ball, those are obviously the two that you immediately look at. And then some of the more secondary needs, you do think about the center position. I think Luke Wattenberg is a really good pass protector, but he leaves a little bit to be desired as a run blocker. And that's another thing that has hurt this run game for the Denver Broncos. So that's more of a secondary need on the offensive side of the ball. Mike McGlinchey has only got a couple more years left on his deal, so maybe some depth at tackle long-term. That's kind of another secondary need. Well, yeah, you do have Chesky too.
Yeah.
So
competition, though. Yeah.
I still think more depth could be something the Broncos would look at. And then you obviously think about wide receiver. I think that, just like you said, a number one receiver is still something this team should look at. And a couple of depth pieces as well. I mean, Troy Franklin hasn't really stepped up for you. There's been a lot of talk about Tez Johnson here in Denver. So those are the directions I think that they could ultimately go.
Yeah. Real quick, as I saw this comment come in, to echo what Gage mentioned, Alex, Chris Thomason of the Denver Gazette reported about an hour ago, 2 hours ago, that the Broncos will not be retaining Javonte Williams, which is not really a surprise. You know, I just go back and forth on it, and I don't think there's a wrong decision either when you talk about the you know, specifically the three. And I don't think that there's a wrong idea for how you would want to go with free agency. I know that what was it Paul that mentioned you know, free agency for defense, draft for offense. I don't hate that strategy. I think if I was looking forward into free agency, I would much rather want to fill the needs of this team, which includes everything, the needs of this team before going into the draft. And then you can just pick whatever you want in whatever rounds you want that you feel are still needs for this team, or, you know, depth for this team. That's kind of how I would still go. Jeff Bryan mentions about Nick Chubb. He is interesting. And I think that the one fascinating thing for me, and I smile because we don't talk about him enough. But like, the reason why I feel like guys like a Nick Chubb, you know, is intriguing is because of Bo Lowry. Nick Chubb has dealt with so many injuries in his career. It's a turnoff. Preface it that it's a turnoff. So many injuries. But you give him at the hands of Bo Lowry, I'm very curious to see what that would be like if you give him someone like that. You obviously would probably want to sign for, you may want to lowball him, get him for like sign him for a 1-year deal, maybe 2, right? If you're lucky. But you know, you bring him in,
insurance policy, quite frankly.
Yeah. But you bring him in, and you know, you see if you could be able to get him and work with Bo Lowry, and if it works, boy, that 1-year deal of signing Nick Chubb is going to go from the best bang for your buck type signing, you know, maybe in the entirety of free agency. And then specifically, you know, you mentioned the tight end room, and I don't need to bring up obviously the theory that I first posed about, you know, Little Jordan Humphrey. But like, nonetheless, as you said,
absolute booty cheeks.
That tight end room is booty cheeks. Like it is just, it is bad. And I think that, you know, one of the moves that is not talked about enough regarding that tight end room, and you mentioned the blocking, is the loss of Chris Manhertz. It's not talked about enough. You know, like, he was a phenomenal run blocking tight end, something that this team desperately needed. And they didn't bring him back. Like, they did not bring him back. He was a surprise cut, if you will. Adam Troutman, solid blocker, good enough to be a tight end too. You need a tight end one. I think there's ways that you could certainly suffice that in the draft. The one sneaky option, sneaky is the wrong way to say this, but the one option in terms of maybe a lofty free agent that you might want to bring in is maybe a Mike Gesicki. But you're talking about if you want to bring a guy in terms of a tight end, he wouldn't necessarily have to be a blocker. You could draft your blocker, right? Like you could draft your blocking tight end. But in free agency, go out and get yourself that Mike Gesicki. Bring him in. Be that dynamic player, for that tight end, type of offense. Wide receiver, I think is going to be one of the fascinating ones because, there are a lot of options. I feel like the Broncos can go with. Everybody's talking about Chris Godwin. Phenomenal fit. I think that I wouldn't even rule out Gage, and I want to spin this to you. I would not rule out the Broncos being slightly aggressive when it comes to this wide receiver room. And what do I mean by that? I meant you sign Chris Godwin and you get Amari Cooper in the room. Gage? Do we lose Gage? Oh, I
interesting. I definitely. Sorry, you're kind of cutting off.
No, you're good. But yeah, Amari Cooper and Chris Godwin.
I would definitely be intrigued by that because at this point you're just trying to throw as many darts on the board at that in that room and just try to see who hits at this point. Courtland Sutton, hopefully he's going to be a piece long term. I do think if the price is right via the trade market, they would move Sutton. And if they could sign both a Chris Godwin and an Amari Cooper in free agency, maybe they view that collectively as an upgrade over Sutton. You could plug Cooper into Sutton's X role. So that would make sense to me, certainly. But I still think that even if they double up in free agency, that won't prevent them from drafting a receiver either. They need to get, at the end of the day, younger and cheaper in that room. If they make a splash signing, especially, they need to get younger and cheaper pieces around that splash signing. So I would not rule out Tez Johnson. I wouldn't even rule out them drafting a wide receiver in the first round if the right one falls to them. The Ohio State kid, maybe Luther Burden out of Missouri. There's a lot of different directions that they could go with that position.
Alec,
that's the Ohio State kid.
Yeah. I still hold true on my prediction that Tyler Warren and Emeka Egbuka is going to be the draft pick, as we currently said on January 21st. But he mentions Alec Ayamir from Stanford, who has ties to David Shaw. Yeah. So as we're looking in, Paul chimes in and says Tez, yeah, and Jeff Ryan mentions Godwin, reunite him with his Penn State. I think they played together actually. I'm sure
they did
over there at Penn State, and I don't know. Interesting. Big Mike mentions that it should be Walter Nolan. I think Nolan's a defensive lineman. We'll talk about those. I think that's a really interesting one because I think defensive line is a conversation where it might be lower in the sense of the offensive weapons, but it's one that I would still probably want to pencil in, and chime in as far as it's still a very interesting need. I saw someone in the chat here talk about DJ Jones. I wouldn't be upset about. Alex said I also want DJ Jones back. I wouldn't be the least bit surprised, Gage. They signed DJ Jones back, but they still address the defensive line in free agency with a youthful player there.
You look at how the Philadelphia Eagles have built their defensive line over this past decade. Even when they've had entrenched starters in there, they've still added depth in higher rounds in the draft. They've still made free agent signings, and they've been borderline Super Bowl contenders for this past decade. So I think that's a very sound strategy. You can never have too many good offensive linemen, and you can never have too many good defensive linemen. If you are sound in the trenches, then you're probably going to win a lot of football games. So if you want to add depth on the defensive line through the draft in the first round, then I am all for it. If you want to make a couple of signings in free agency, including bringing DJ Jones back, yes, absolutely. The reason why this team had so much success this year was because of how well they played in the trenches. So, yes, more trench depth, please.
Joe, offensive line, probably. But I will say defensive line, I don't think I would lose my collective mind. And I gauge, as you were talking, I don't think you'd lose your collective mind. I think the one where I would really lose it is if we took a corner. Is if we took a cornerback, in the first round. Safety would be not necessarily losing my mind, because I don't want to certainly rule that out. But speaking of safety, you want to talk about a need that we didn't necessarily pinpoint as one. Obviously, everybody knows the picture that I have in this wall here. It's hard to replace a guy like that. PJ Locke, it's hard. It's hard to replace a guy like Justin Simmons, with PJ Locke. But unfortunately, they might have some tough decisions to make. And I think we've had these conversations, to be made. And that is, do you still hold on to PJ Locke? He's going to end up having 1 year left, right? Because he signed that 2-year deal. So he's going to turn into right now where you're talking about probably a cap casualty as we get closer to training camp, depending on what happens there in free agency. I think that if you want to go absolutely big or go home, one thing, and I think you and I have mentioned this, is pairing him with Javon Holland, right? Meaning Brandon Jones. You pair Brandon Jones with Javon Holland again and get a chance to see what Jim Leonard can do there. But safety is a very sneaky need for this team.
I just pulled up the cap figures if you were to cut PJ Locke, and it would be the same number for either a pre-June 1st or a post-June 1st cut. $0.19 million with just $1 million in dead money. So that would be a very costly move if the Broncos were to elect to make it. I do think PJ Locke is a fresh starter at the safety position, but he proved that he probably shouldn't be a long-term guy for you. So I do believe that they're going to look to upgrade there. Javon Holland, like you said, could be an ideal option there. Yeah, I think that the game that he had in that playoff game against Buffalo very much exposed that the Broncos have a hole at the safety position that they have to fill.
And to Jeff Bryan, this isn't the first time that I've seen Jeremy Chin mentioned in this chat. But the one thing I will say to Jeremy Chin, he's a little bit different than PJ. Chin is your much better, by the way, I should say much better version of a Jamal Adams. He's their linebacker, safety, almost rover. He's the physical thumper, that you're going to add to that team. I still think very much that kind of player is a need, for this team moving forward. And I will say the moment, let's just say they add Jeremy Chin, is probably the moment you probably put a guy like a J.L. Skinner on notice, is if you bring in a guy like that in, versus kind of seeing what you want to have there with Skinner. I don't want to rule anything out though, because I would love Jeremy Chin. Talanoa Hufanga is another one that I would love to see, for this team. I think he's kind of still in that mode of linebacker safety, but he's far more versatile to where he's such a playmaker on the back end. that he would fit really well, I feel, with what Leonard does in terms of his aggressive style. And then Cameron Bynum. He's more than just a choreographer in the end zone after every turnover or something, but he's a phenomenal player, right, Gage? Like he's a great safety. So I feel like he's another one of those safeties that you could bring in, and who knows, maybe after every single touchdown they're doing a line dance in the end zone or something, after every score. But
absolutely,
yeah. There were some questions too, of course, about the other positions that we mentioned, Gage, and that was linebacker. Let's touch on linebacker.
Yeah, I mean, that's a position group where I think that you're pretty much going to have to completely clean out. Alex Singleton coming on torn ACL, he is a very favorable cap figure in terms of potentially being a cap casualty. They can save a pretty substantial amount of money with a fairly low dead cap hit. So I think Alex Singleton could have gone his way out. Cody Ball.
We might have lost Gage there for a little bit. But no, yeah, I think that it's going to be really interesting to see what they do at linebacker, because like you look overall with the linebacker room, and you guys were talking about it in the you guys look at it from that linebacker room, like it's Alex Singleton and Cody Barton. And I mean, Cody Barton is great in coverage. I mean, he made a few, plays there in terms of the, in terms of the room, and looks like he came back here, Gage. You're not frozen. But yeah, you're good.
How much of what I said did you hear?
I will say about an 8th, but you were starting to kind of hit the nail on the head there a little bit as far as the linebacker room and possibly remaking it entirely.
Yes. I mean, Cody Barton, him and Justin Sternad are both impending free agents, and I don't think either one of them are going to be back. I'm not a huge fan of Cody Barton in coverage. I'm not a huge fan of what he brings as a run defender. And Justin Sternad has proven that he's basically a non-starter. He's a good special teams player, but not somebody that you'd want to be starting. Alex Singleton, he's got a very favorable cap figure in terms of potentially being a cap casualty, low amount of dead money, high savings if they were to move on from him. So I don't see him being back. I think the only guy in that room that's probably going to be retained is Drew Sanders. Unfortunately, when you look at the free agent pool for linebackers, there's just not a lot there. Levante David kind of leads the list, and he's going to be 35 years old. And for him, it's either return to Tampa Bay or retire. So that's basically not an option. If the Broncos want to improve at the linebacker position, it's probably going to have to be through the draft.
Yeah. Obviously, Dre Greenlaw, is one from San Francisco. And obviously he's one you get him in the hands of Bo Lowry and watch Greenlaw cook. But no, you might be able to get I should say Greenlaw for a little bit cheaper. I was also gonna say there's some other players I feel like, and it's interesting. I'm just very curious to see how they attack the room, because how you doing, how you doing, Mohammed? Thanks for joining us, man. I feel like if you look at it from the standpoint of that linebacker room, I'm with you. I think that they can definitely replace that room in terms of what they can have in that linebacker room. Cody Barton, I feel like, was solid in certain situations in the pass coverage game, but to your point, he just left a lot to be desired on certain run angles and everything. It wasn't just him. Excuse me. Justin Sternad was that same way. And, I think a lot of Broncos country would be annoyed if the Broncos brought back Justin Sternad. It doesn't even matter the length of the deal, but if they brought him back, it might annoy a lot of fans. But I just think that when you look at the linebacker room, for me, there are some interesting names. Like there are a couple, and I can't necessarily take credit for it because in conversations and stuff with some of the few people in Broncos like Twitter and Broncos country, it's like there are two players that are in particular, like with one team, that I'm very curious if you give him the coaching of like this aggressive style defense, how could they be? And that'd be like a Robert Spillane and a Divine Diablo from the Raiders. Like both, like either one of them or both. It doesn't matter to me. Like, they're good enough players that are linebackers, and I think both of them are free agents where you add them to the room. I think that Spillane is actually a very gritty player. And that is actually something that, like, I would not be the least bit upset with if they brought him in. And I don't mind the brotherly connection. Like, say you bring Cody Barton back, and you draft his brother from Utah. You draft Lander Barton, and you keep it in the family at linebacker. I wouldn't be upset about that either. So I think that linebacker is certainly one that is kind of flying under the radar a little bit. We touched briefly on center, but like, what is one need though that you do feel like maybe we touched on it a little bit, but what is one need that you think maybe not enough people are talking about?
I mean, we kind of talked about defensive line already. That's one where some people are mentioning it, some people are not mentioning it. Another one I would say, and I think I also briefly touched on it, is depth on the offensive line. I know they like Alex Palczewski as a swing tackle, but you can never have too many good offensive linemen. And guys start going down at that position. You need guys who can step up. And I just think that the more depth you have on the offensive line, the better. So that's another one for me where I'm looking to make some additions.
Yeah. I will say that the one, and I think we did mention it a little bit, and you mentioned it, it's center. I think center's the one where even though the offensive line did play at an A+ level this year, being a top 5 unit, like I just think that you look at the room, if you're going to nitpick it just a little bit, it really was that center position. I mean, Wattenberg is enough for him to be center, and Joe chimes in the comments about it. That center is certainly a need, and like let's just hypothetically say Ryan Jensen, local kid from Colorado, comes out of retirement, and he basically says, "Oh, I want to come back out of retirement and play football again." I'm sending an offer sheet over to Ryan Jensen and having him be your immediate fill-in for center. Like, and that's kind of like how I feel. Like, if you know that you can be able to fill a need at center with a massive upgrade like that, I'm all for that. And I agree, Paul. Like, he's fine. It's just there's just that other angle to it. Like he's a elite pass blocking tight end, but you put him in the run game, he's Swiss cheese. Like, it's a Jekyll and Hyde experience of the pass blocking and run blocking. He's elite in one area and just god awful in the others. So I will say I did see a comment that got mentioned, and it was in regards to I believe it was corner, saying that we do need corners. Like, I agree. I do think that we do need corners. We should probably preface it this way: you can always add a corner, but like the way that I would probably look at it, Gage, is the Levi Wallace experiment was a disaster. So I think that the angle where the Broncos should go after for a corner is attack it that exact same way. Maybe you try and hit gold with someone else that's not a Levi Wallace, but you bring in a veteran corner, to that room, or you go draft a corner, from like day 3 in rounds like 5 to 7, and then you could be able to develop him and everything. But that's the way I would go. So you can certainly add a corner, but it's certainly not a need.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, long term, there are going to be some questions at nickel about Jaquan McMillan. Is he going to be your long-term answer there? I mean, you have Riley Moss, who I know some people in the fan base are like, oh, get rid of Riley Moss. He sucks. But if you know ball, then you know that Riley Moss is the future at the second boundary corner spot. And then there's no
That's my
conversation.
Jackie.
There's no conversation need to be had, obviously, about Pat Surtain. So, yeah, I do think that depth there is a need. Chris Abrams-Drain stepped up and played well for you last year. Adding another veteran would always be a good move to make, but I don't think that it's such a pressing need as opposed to some of these other positions like linebacker and safety and maybe even defensive line on that side of the ball.
Yeah. And it is going to be interesting to see because, like, you look at it from just from the Broncos side of things. That's what makes this so exciting because, and a lot of people feel like, in this off season, like there's also a way where they could just sit on their hands. Now, that would piss me off if they sit on their hands. And what I'm saying by, sit on your hands, I'm basically saying they sit on their hands and they extend, Zach Allen, Nick Bonito, possibly Courtland Sutton. Both great moves. They should. They should extend them, right? Like I'm not saying they shouldn't, but if that's the entirety of their moves, I will be very pissed if that's like the entirety of all the moves that they make. So I think that as we touch on it, if you look at it from the side of things for the Broncos, who are some of these players that are as we talked about free agency, are extension candidates, and then who's a trade piece that you feel the Broncos might call back up in terms of a team or call regarding maybe a trade target or a couple, in this offseason as well.
Well, I think you named, obviously, the extension candidates right off the bat. Zach Allen, Nick Bonito, and Courtland Sutton. Those are all foundational pieces that should be brought back long-term, and they should be rewarded for all of the hard work that they've put in for this team. So those are the three that stick out like a sore thumb. And then as far as somebody that they could maybe look to move on from in a trade, that's tough because they're more in the business of acquiring pieces. We talked a little bit earlier in the show about Courtland Sutton, if they could compensate by getting maybe a Chris Godwin or an Amari Cooper in free agency. I could see them maybe doing that if they don't want to extend Sutton and maybe go with more of the bargain option there, if you will, because I do think you could get Amari Cooper for a pretty solid bargain. So that is something to think about. And then as far as trade piece to add, David Njoku. I've been pounding the table for them to trade for David Njoku for months. They didn't do it at the trade deadline last year, and I'm going to bring back the David Njoku propaganda on Broncos Syndicate until they either make the move or they make some sort of lateral move at the tight end position.
Paul getting a bit spicy, and this is actually not the first time I've seen that. I saw someone on X make that point there as well. It's and I think that's where, as we come full circle and we're rounding out the entire show, that's where it's going to be interesting, because the way that the playoffs have ended, like there are Big Mike mentions that we did offer a second for Njoku we were offered a second for Njoku, and we said no. So not to make you even more mad
that you heard that.
Yeah, so
I never heard that.
So not to make you even more mad, but like saying no to a second round pick for for David Njoku. But as we were kind of winding down, these playoffs, there were two players that I feel like might actually we're celebrating. We might be celebrating with those birthday balloons. But there's two players that might actually be of a target for the Broncos. One, yeah, he kind of crashed out there a little bit in the Ravens and Bills game. But Mark Andrews, I am very curious now. It certainly didn't seem like he thought as the season was starting to kind of hit that midway point gauge, and even at the end of the season. But Mark Andrews, man, it's very interesting to see how that'll all shake out, because I think that he went from not a trade or to a trade candidate at the very, very beginning of the year, not a trade candidate, and then at the end of the year, man, the Broncos might actually need to trade for Mark Andrews again. And then the second guy, Cooper Kupp.
I think Cooper Kupp might be a little bit more of a pipe dream. I just don't see the Rams moving off of him. He is such a reliable player. He's been a reliable player for them for so long. I don't see that one happening, but Mark Andrews, I definitely could. They've got a guy in Isaiah Likely who could be primed to take that number one tight end role. So I could easily see that. And I know that Andrews is getting a lot of crap for his bad plays that he had in that playoff game, but he's been a reliable weapon for Lamar Jackson for so long. I truly believe that Mark Andrews could be a good fit here, and I think Sean Payton would find a lot of clever ways to use him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Kupp is definitely money. That is for sure. It's going to be the Kupp thing will be interesting because, as much as you do say it might be money related, it's going to be interesting to see how things unfold there, because it's almost like the other teams might be calling the bluff of the Rams, meaning like daring them to move on from Cooper in terms of like just cut him. And because he's so old, it's going to be interesting to see. It is going to be interesting to see how all that unfolds. But I will say, yes, it might seem like, Cooper Kupp, who is injury prone, and his cup might actually be half empty. I'm not all that surprised, or would not be surprised if Kupp was pretty high on the Broncos board, because, I think you and I talk about it all the time, and it's one of the reasons why I'm so high on guys like Matthew Golden and Emeka Egbuka here in Denver. Like those types of players that are the savvy route runners, that are the savvy players that can fight in traffic and play outside or inside, and those players, Gage, are just perfect fits for the Sean Payton type of offense. And so if you're able to probably get a Cooper Kupp for however long he's available, in terms of years, you gotta take it, don't you? And specifically with Bo Nix's window.
Absolutely. I mean, Cooper Kupp is such a precision route runner, and that's what this offense is predicated on: precision and timing. So Cooper Kupp would be an outstanding fit. I just don't see him leaving that cocoon of Sean McVay, Matthew Stafford, and the Los Angeles Rams. But if Stafford decides to retire, maybe Kupp would have a change of heart.
Yeah, you never know. Moving forward, now you touched on it. We might be having this conversation. We are going to have the conversation. We probably should lead it off by a team that just can't get out of their own way. And what do I mean by that? I mean get out of their own way, meaning the Patriot way. The New England Patriots hired Mike Vrabel, great coach. Let's preface it this way. Hired Mike Vrabel, great coach. But then they hire, as it came down to today, Josh McDaniels is back with the New England Patriots as an offensive coordinator. So as we try to transition now to the head coaching cycle, man, that's got to be something. And I think it's one of the reasons why I said, Gage, like, I just want the New England Patriots to just go away from the new. It had nothing to do with Vrabel, but like, just can we just please move on from the Patriot way and just bring some fresh blood into the building?
I could not agree more. And listen, Mike Vrabel, I feel like, has distanced himself enough from the Patriot way. He built his own culture in Tennessee, but bringing Josh McDaniels back, it's just like, why, dude? It's the ghosts of Belichick's past. That's what it is. And Josh McDaniels, we all know that he is a scuzzy, scummy, awful human being. But to give him credit where it's due, he is a good offensive coordinator. He can scheme up plays. He's good at that. But in terms of a guy that you want to groom a young hopefully franchise quarterback in Drake May, Josh McDaniels is not the guy that I would have picked to do it. I understand that they were able to get halfway decent performance out of Mac Jones, but the difference there was Mac Jones was handpicked by Josh McDaniels and Bill Belichick. McDaniels is inheriting Drake May for better or for worse, and he's going to have to find a way to cultivate and foster that relationship. And if there's one guy who is dog shit at cultivating and fostering relationships, it is Josh McDaniels. So good luck, buddy.
Yeah. So if we hear rumblings of trade rumors surrounding Drake May, Javon Baker, and Demario Douglas, if we start to hear some rumblings of trade rumors surrounding those three players, I think you could pretty much maybe even Hunter Henry as well. I think you could probably maybe realize that, okay, this is a culture thing down there with of course McDaniels.
Austin Hooper in there too.
Yep, throw Austin Hooper in there as well. I just man, I just think it's so interesting. And as I said, like, the Vrabel hire was fantastic. Like, I've got nothing against Vrabel. He was wrongly ousted in Tennessee, and this seemed like the perfect fit for him was New England. It was just one where it's like, come on, man. Like, could we please do something else? We appreciate you, Jack. And hopefully, the Raiders can be able to find a coach soon. It was supposed to be Ben Johnson. It ended up not being Ben Johnson. And if you hire Vance Joseph,
now the rumblings are Pete Carroll.
I was gonna say, if the Raiders do hire Vance Joseph, we just want to say thank you for the 2 third-round picks in advance. By the way, as we move on to some of the other ones, speaking of Ben Johnson, we alluded to it. He took so many different interviews. The Bears did. But interestingly enough, what made this so interesting with Ben Johnson and everything surrounding it from the game was he was actually broken down by, I believe it was Ari on Twitter. They never held, Gage, an in-person interview with Ben Johnson. They never, I don't think they did a Zoom, maybe they did a Zoom interview, but they never did an in-person interview with Ben Johnson. And they finally come to the decision of, hiring Johnson. And, for everybody that was going to give a lot of praise or, so forth to the AFC West, for all the coaches that are going to be in the AFC West, the NFC North, though, is really stacked now. Matt LaFleur, Dan Campbell, Kevin O'Connell, and now Ben Johnson added to the mix.
Yeah, and you could argue that there are a couple of more head coaches in that division that are in waiting. In Aaron Glenn, which is pretty sure he's going to get cycled this offseason, and then also Brian Flores. There was kind of a running joke when Matt Eberflus was still the head coach of the Bears that, oh yeah, he's the 6th or 7th best head coach in his own division.
Yeah.
So it just feels like that whole division has become sort of a head coach factory. And Ben Johnson was the guy that Caleb Williams always wanted. Caleb went on the Amon-Ra St. Brown podcast and publicly stated that he wanted him. And then there was that whole prank where a couple of kids got in touch, got a hold of Caleb's phone number and got in touch with him and said that, "This is Johnson, I'm excited to work with you." And Caleb seemed genuinely pumped when he responded back, thinking it actually was Ben Johnson. So yeah, man, the Bears got their guy, and I know a lot of Lions fans are salty because Johnson had that stinker in his final game as a Lion, and now he's going to coach their division rival.
Yep.
They feel a certain level of betrayal, but the NFL is just a brutal business, man. That's how it happens sometimes. Dan Campbell knew going into this year that he was probably going to lose Ben Johnson, and the Bears were always going to be that attractive job because of Caleb Williams. And it's kind of funny. Sean McVay, elite offensive mind, moves on from Jared Goff because he couldn't win the big game with him. First year away from Jared Goff, another former number 1 overall pick wins the Super Bowl. Let's see if Ben Johnson can follow a similar mold with Caleb Williams. Caleb's obviously going to have to take massive steps forward in his own game for that to happen. But if there is a level of stability that the Bears finally have now with Johnson, it's going to give him every opportunity to do that.
And one of the biggest draws, if not the biggest draw, was Caleb Williams. And so it's going to be very interesting to see that particular marriage and all the weapons around him. And by the way, just a brief bunny trail about the Bears. Can we please stop mocking Ashton Genty already to the Chicago Bears? They have far bigger needs on their roster than running back. They have Roschon Johnson and they have DeAndre Swift, but and obviously a lot of it was the doing of Caleb Williams in the sack department. But they need offensive line help, far more of all the needs that is on that football team. Offensive line is numero uno, for this team. So can we please start mocking offensive linemen to the Bears, not Ashton Genty, speaking from a concerned Bronco fan who probably wants Ashton Genty. But anyway, I digress.
I mean, you think about how the Lions built their team. They built their team through the offensive line, bringing in Penei Sewell. They had Taylor Decker and Frank Ragnow already in place. They brought in Graham Glasgow as a free agent back from Denver. He was originally with Detroit, came to Denver, and then went back to Detroit. So that's how they built their team, was through the offensive line. I could see Chicago emulating the same game plan.
Moving forward to some of the other teams that do not have a head coach yet. That would be, so obviously, as we said, the Patriots have Mike Vrabel. The Bears have Ben Johnson. Next up is the New York Football Jets. It seems like things are trending in the direction of Aaron Glenn, who, by the way, now that we're talking about Ben Johnson getting a job and possibly now Aaron Glenn, can we just and specifically with the Jets job, can we just sit back and just enjoy the fact that all the crap that Bronco fans endured, from Sean Payton and all the trash that he was, giving in terms of, all to the Jets, all for them to basically, or I should say possibly, cower a little bit and actually hire a Sean Payton pupil, if you will, from that tree in Aaron Glenn. Can we just savor that for just a little bit, possibly the fact that they might actually hire Aaron Glenn as head coach, for the New York Jets, which does seem to be trending in that direction.
I didn't think of it from that perspective. I thought of it from, the Jets, Aaron Glenn played for them before, so he knows the team, he knows the culture,
Yeah.
Maybe kind of trying to emulate the whole Dan Campbell in Detroit thing. But I never made that connection, and that just makes it even funnier. I think that Aaron Glenn would be a very interesting hire, but we saw that defense against the Commanders get absolutely exposed. And I don't think that Aaron Glenn is leaving Detroit on the happiest of terms. So that's going to be very interesting to monitor. It seems that the two top teams interested in Glenn's services right now are the New York Jets and the New Orleans Saints. So we'll see how that ultimately materializes.
Yep. I think it's going to be an Aaron Glenn. That leaves us now with Sean Payton's former club, who let go of Dennis Allen, and also contract expired of Darren Rizzi, who the Broncos, and it seems like the Chicago Bears might actually be in a bit of should I say a bidding war? I'm using air quotes, but like a bidding war a little bit, for was
For Rizzi.
For Rizzi, I should say, with the Bears. Which, by the way, I'm not upset. I'm not upset if the Broncos also promote Chris Banjo, because it means that I should say I was stunned in the sense that the Broncos are considering promoting Chris Banjo, which, by the way, came from the words of Mike Westhoff, the Broncos special teams legend. Hope he's doing well. I like it just in the sense that, like, when you look at it from the standpoint of the young coaching staff, it at least might bring out this young movement of the coaching staff a little bit more. But nonetheless, we move on. The Saints and then the Cowboys. Those are the two remaining teams that are now going to be searching for a head coach.
Yep. And New Orleans, I've heard Mike McCarthy is a very strong possibility if they can't get Aaron Glenn. It seems like Glenn is their number one target, but the Jets seem to be zeroing in on Glenn. So right now, I would say Mike McCarthy is a very strong possibility for New Orleans. And for Dallas, it looks like they're going to either go with their current offensive coordinator in Brian Schottenheimer or their former offensive coordinator and current Eagle offensive coordinator, Kellen Moore. Moore has a very strong relationship with the Cowboys organization, with Jerry Jones. He played for them. He's got a good relationship with Dak Prescott. They just extended Dak. So the only scenario where I could see the Cowboys moving on from Dak is if they were to maybe get a Shedeur Sanders. But that would be a package deal with Dion, and it seems like Dion is going to stay at Colorado. Mm-hmm. So it seems that they're going to be trying to find a guy who can get the best out of Dak, and that's either going to be Brian Schottenheimer or Kellen Moore.
Man, Cowboys are down bad, man. Cowboys are seriously down bad. To go from Mike McCarthy to Brian Schottenheimer. By the way, that is also, if they do hire Schottenheimer, that would be like the biggest. We royally screwed up and should have promoted Dan Quinn the head coach. If I've ever seen one.
Cowboys get a Cowboy.
Cowboys get a Cowboy, just like the Chargers always Charger. Yeah, so it's just going to be such a very interesting cycle. We will always have you covered right here on the 5280 podcast, and of course over there on Gage's show, Broncos Syndicate, for all Broncos news and possible NFL news that gets linked to the Broncos over there for Gage on the Broncos Syndicate, and of course the 5280 podcast. It's been a great show. Hopefully next week, we can get together to get the full crew of all of us together, not just myself and Gage, but obviously our bald hero, Glenn Hauser, and the bearded wonder, Mundungus himself, back in the building. So, but again, want to say thank you guys so much for hopping on into the chat with us. It was a very lively chat. Want to say thank you again to Jeff Bryan for the super chat. It was very much a huge thank you to you. And as we send things off, do you have before we go? Do you have actually anything planned currently right now? Obviously, as we enter the off-season Gage for Broncos Syndicate.
So the news with Javonte dropped, and last few days, I haven't been able to get any content up because I've been helping my family move. So I'm going to be getting right onto that. And I've got the Shrine Bowl coming up at the end of the week. I'm going to be traveling down to Dallas for the Shrine Bowl. I'll be attending the practices, getting some early scouting done on potential Broncos. I'll be seeing Shedeur Sanders down there and several Colorado receivers. Shiloh Sanders will be down there. Cam Silman Craig, the other Colorado safety. It's going to be a really good time down there, and that will help generate a lot of content over on the channel.
If you ever see any Nebraska players, make sure you report some, not so false information. Maybe bump up their stock just a little bit. That would be very enjoyable, Gage. So thank you.
Let's find out if there are any Nebraska players.
There should be. The Cedar Bowl, by the way, got a bit of a surprise, and actually Thomas Fedoni, the tight end from Nebraska, who should be an interesting draft eval. Of all the Nebraska players, it's going to be an interesting draft eval for him. Nash Huntmaker, I think, is the one that was maybe with the Shrine Bowl, I think. So
he's at Shrine and Isaiah Nair.
Isaiah Nair, yeah. But anyway, yeah, so thank you to everybody for hopping in the chat. There will be no Mainly Broncos tomorrow on Wednesday. We are planning to do a show for Friday. I have a family event tomorrow, and I'm actually going to the Nuggets game on Thursday. So we are planning to do a Friday show for you of Mainly Broncos. We are still going to be doing a show this week for Mainly. But again, I just want to say thank you guys to everybody who has tuned in to not just the 5280 podcast, but every single show that has been a part of the MHRT network. Make sure you hit that subscribe button, and make sure you follow both Gage and I over there on socials at Gage Madrid NFL and myself at Cameron Parker PO. It has been a phenomenal show, and we will see you next Tuesday.
Fast lane when I pass in the street, bag of money in the passenger seat. Tempo's been asking for me on the road from the west to the east. Way up, I might never come down, cause the coast racking up the flame out. So high, I might never come down.